Well, welcome back all my YouTubers. Now we're going to take a short break from my usual classic dirt bike videos this time to show you some fantastic old classic motorcycles from the Bikes in the Park event at Kirkcaldy in Fife in 2016. Now this is an annual event laid on by the Kirkcaldy Motorcycle Racing Club to commemorate 40 years of road racing around Beveridge Park in Kirkcaldy. So we're going to have a look at some of the nice machines that were on display on the day. Now, as you would expect, I don't know an awful lot about the bikes that you're going to see, but I'll try and give you as many details as I can possibly give you, as these kind of bikes are not really my forte. I'm usually into the old classic motocross dirt bikes, but there's some very nice machines coming up in this very short video. Now this is a lovely old BSA road racing bike, and looks like it's got that fantastic BSA Gold Star 500 motor in the chassis. Now this Bikes in the Park event was set up by the Kirkcaldy Motorcycle Racing Club, who, if you're of a certain age, will remember back in the early 1960s and 70s they used to run motorcycle road race meetings around the park's perimeter, where the great and the good of British motorcycle road racing would come to Kirkcaldy and take part. And this Bikes in the Park gathering is organised to commemorate 40 years of racing motorcycles at this famous Beveridge Park location. But this old BSA racer is just typical of the kind of machine that you would have seen racing around the park way back in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, our next lovely road racing classic. Now this is a Seeley 500. Now I don't know an awful lot about Seeley, but I think it's in relation to Colin Seeley, who designed and built these bikes way back in the day. And of course, if you were like myself and of a certain age, and you frequented Beveridge Park way back in the 1960s when these events were taking place, then these are the kind of bikes that you would be seeing lining up on the track, waiting to strut their stuff around the Beveridge Park racetrack. And you can only imagine what kind of sound comes from that big bore exhaust pipe. And of course this is Andy Richardson's Seeley 500. Now I don't know too much about Andy, and I don't profess to know much about these particular kinds of bikes, but there's some very nice classics, and they're well worthy of a look here on my classic bike channel. Now the engine in this machine is a 500 BSA. Now it doesn't look like a Gold Star engine, but then again I stand to be corrected on that particular item. Disc brakes, of course, which were very rare for these kind of motorcycles back in the day. But nevertheless, an absolutely gorgeous looking racing machine, and what good it would be to sling your leg over one of these things and take it on a few laps of the track. Okay, next up we have this very nice looking Ducati SD900. Now I might be guessing here, but I think this could be a 1978 Ducati. Now as far as I remember, I think these things had a 5-speed gearbox and electronic ignition, which was quite rare for 1978. Now the engine was a 90-degree L twin cylinder machine, Now if I remember rightly, they made a sporty version of this bike back in the day. I think it was called the 900 Super Sport Desmo, which had the clip-on handlebars and a small half fairing fitted. It looks like this particular bike has been dropped on its right hand side at one point, but nevertheless, and despite the slight damage on the casing, it's still a gorgeous looking old Ducati, and certainly a very rare classic from back in the day. Okay, our next featured classic is this lovely 1949 Vincent Rapide. Now these bikes look eerily similar to the legendary Vincent Black Shadow, which of course was always renowned as being the world's first ever superbike. Now Vincent HRD was of course founded by Howard Raymond Davis, although in later years the Vincent company dropped the HRD logo, and then these bikes were then simply called the Vincent, as many of these bikes were shipped to the USA, and it was just to avoid any confusion with the Harley Davidson company. But as far as the engineering goes, in the early 1950s, these Vincents were superbly engineered, and this engine alone is just a piece of mechanical sculpture. Just such a beautiful looking motor. Now these Rapide motorcycles maybe don't have the same status as the mega motorcycle, the Vincent Black Shadow, but nevertheless this was still a fantastic motorcycle and superbly engineered. Now if I remember, this Speedo was about a 5-inch Speedo, and it was quite similar to the Speedo that was fitted on the Vincent Black Shadow. Drum brakes of course on this old motorcycle, cable operated, and the linkage and levers look almost bicycle like in their appearance. Now while I was grabbing these video clips of this very nice Vincent, the owner told me that this bike was actually kept in the house and not in a garage or lock-up, and going by the bike's rarity, I'm not really surprised, but it's such a nice looking old British classic. So there you have it, a very nice looking 1949 Vincent Rapide. Okay, our next featured machine is this rather nice looking 1978 Suzuki GS1000. Now back in the day these were considered one of the early super bikes, and were maybe not as fast as the mega Kawasaki Z1, but these were still very quick bikes, and these engines were superb. Now the GS1000 DOHC, of course, for the double overhead cam. Sounds really technical, but it just means that it had twin cams rather than a single. But the inline 4-cylinder motor was very good for a bike from 1978. Now these were hugely popular in the UK, and if you couldn't afford a Z900 or a Z1000, then these GS1000 Suzukis were a very good alternative and an excellent bike to ride. 4 exhausts of course into these twin silencers at the rear. But I'm sure that this particular bike will bring back some nice memories for some of my YouTube viewers, and this particular example here is in superb condition. Whether the bike's been restored or not, I'm not sure, but it's in fantastic condition for a bike from 1978. So there you have it, another iconic machine from the late 1970s. That's the Suzuki GS1000. But for me personally, this was the bike that did it for me in the late 1970s when I was just a young slip of a lad. This of course is a 1979 RD400 Yamaha. Now these were just absolute dream bikes for a youngster to have way back in the day. These were super quick bikes, and twin cylinder of course, but these were very rapid machines. And this particular example of course is the RD400 with I'm sure these were called the DX, with the disc brake at the rear, and this is still a gorgeous example of one of these flying machines, and it would be great just to sling your leg over one of these bikes again and tear down the highway. But a very nice example of a 1979 RD400. And again, these bikes were capable of insane speeds for the 1970s, and if you were a young lad and you had one of these bikes underneath you, you were a very special person indeed in the late 1970s. But a very nice example of one of these RD400s. But of course the baby brother to the RD400 was this bike, the RD250. Now in the late 1970s, this was a bike that you could just go out, get yourself a provisional license, come back, put L plates on one of these bikes and tear down the road at insane speeds. And there was many a young man lost their life riding one of these RD250 rocket ships. But for me personally, this was the bike that I always wanted when I was a young man of 19 and 20. I always wanted one of these RD250 Yamahas, and I was always jealous of some of my mates who already had one, because they were just absolutely stunning looking bikes for a 1970s machine. But it was a crazy time to be a young motorcyclist in the late 1970s when these bikes were going around. You previous to buying one of these bikes, you maybe had a 50cc moped, and then you could just take your provisional license and stick a set of L plates on one of these bikes, and then you could tear down the road at in excess of 90 miles per hour. And that's why many a young man lost their lives trying to tame these ultra quick Yamaha RD250s. Next up we've got a very old BSA classic. Now this is a 1924 350 BSA, and as old motorcycles go, I don't think they get much older than this particular machine. I mean, this bike was so high tech for its day, it even had a pannier box on the back. But you just got to love these old BSA motors. Now I think this was the old side valve engine on this bike. Now back in the day, these couldn't have been the easiest of bikes to ride with the hand change gear lever and all the other bits and pieces that were going on with the manual oil pump, etc. So it couldn't have been an easy bike to ride along the road. But of course that was back in a time when motorcyclists were made of hardier stuff than they do these days, with our own bikes having electric starts, etc. But back in the day, motorcyclists were real motorcyclists. Now I'm sure these bikes had the acetylene light, whereby you would mix the calcium carbide with water to produce acetylene gas to give you lights. But it's still a lovely example of one of these old 1924 350 BSAs. Okay, next up we have another Vincent. This time it's a 1950 Vincent Comet. Now this bike had a similar frame layout to the big Black Shadow. The cantilever rear suspension, of course, and Vincent's own hydraulic forks up the front. Yet another piece of Vincent superb engineering. Now the frame never had any bottom frame rail on this bike. The motor was used as a stressed member. Now the engine was an air-cooled 500cc overhead valve single cylinder motor with the cylinder block and cylinder head made from alloy. Now the cylinder also had a cast iron liner inserted into its cylinder, and if I remember, these bikes had a Burman gearbox. Now they also had 6-volt electrics, which was about par for the course for motorcycles from 1950. But yet again, this is another fantastic example of one of these Vincent motorcycles. There's certainly something about an old British classic motorcycle with its chrome and black frame and these superbly engineered motors. There's certainly something about these bikes that make them stand out from everything else that you see at these classic show events. Now this bike looks like it's got some quick release mechanism for removing the front wheel, which is not a bad thing if you get stuck away out in the countryside, I suppose. But some very nice engineering again on this old bike. But that's a 1950 500 Vincent Comet. Now of course it wasn't just the shiny bikes that was on show. We have some nice rusty gold here in the shape of this what looks like an old Villiers New Hudson from about 1954. Now this bike looks like it's been lying at the bottom of the Atlantic for 20 years, but nevertheless a good project bike for somebody if they want to restore an old machine. I'm not sure what this particular bike is. It looks like an old Excelsior, but I know absolutely nothing about it. But another piece of rusty gold. Also at the show was this, I think it's an Italian made Legano automatic with that very nice little 50cc Sachs engine. But another good project bike if you are looking for something for a winter project. Now, just before you all get far too excited and think that this is an ancient Indian motorcycle from the early 1900s, then I'm sorry to tell you that these are just modern interpretations of these old motorcycles. This was a manufacturer who was at the show showcasing these old machines, which are actually new bikes but are made to look like machines from the early 1900s. Now, they're powered by a small, I don't know if it's a Chinese two-stroke motor, but nevertheless a very nice collection of these old imitation Indian motorcycles. Now, what the actual market that the vendor was aiming for here, I'm not entirely sure whether these were to be used as racing motorcycles in a special 50cc class event, I don't know, but these were very nicely made and certainly had that look of a bike from the early 1900s. I mean, even this Harley Davidson looked like it was more than 120 years old, but a very nice collection of these old imitation motorcycles. Okay, next up, one of my personal favourites of the Japanese bikes from the early 1970s. This, of course, is a 1972 Suzuki GT 380 triple. A 3-cylinder two-stroke, of course, with these beautiful twin exhaust pipes down either side of the bike. Now, back in the day, I actually owned a Suzuki GT 380B version of one of these bikes, and it's just one of these machines that I wish I'd never ever sold and kept a hold of it, because these bikes sound absolutely superb when you get them fired up. Now, this particular example here has to be a fully restored bike, because it's just far too nice to be in original condition from back in that year, but it's an absolutely gorgeous looking machine with Suzuki's Ram Air cooling system. Now, this Ram Air cooling system was widely used on other Suzuki models, including the GT 250 Twin. But this is a fine example of one of these Suzuki GT 380s, and the more I look at this bike, the more I want to just go out and see if I can buy another one, because I just absolutely loved my GT 380 when I had it, and like I say, when the bikes get started up, these things just sound absolutely brilliant. Now, I don't know if these were the answer to Kawasaki's KH triple bikes when Kawasaki launched their triple two-strokes back in the day, and of course Suzuki's CCI lubrication system was another one of the unique oil lubrication systems for the engines that they had on these bikes back in the day. But this bike is certainly a show winner, and I've yet to see another one of these GT 380s that look as good as this particular example. Okay, just to finish off this part 1 video of Bikes in the Park 2016, we're going to take a look at this beautiful 1955 Sunbeam S8 twin cylinder machine. Now, once again, another superb piece of British ingenuity and engineering, and this bike was reputed to be based upon the BMW R75 motor. Now, these were described at the time as LAT engines, which was a prefix for line ahead twin. Now, the engine layout was quite similar to a car, and these had a dry clutch and unbelievably shaft drive for a bike from 1955. But yet again, another fantastic British motorcycle. Now, this gathering of these motorcycles in the park event was held for about 2 or 3 years initially, although in subsequent years the event tended to be cancelled due to the crappy British summer weather. So this Bikes in the Park event is now held indoors each and every year. But it's certainly worth a visit if you're in the area at the time. And there's some fantastic looking motorcycles to see at this Bikes in the Park event. So hope you enjoyed this brief escape from my usual looking at classic dirt bikes. Of course, this is only some of the motorcycles that we came across on the day at this event. So if you're a subscriber to my channel, then look out for more of these fantastic motorcycles coming up in part 2.